"You're not priority! Sit down!" The words snapped through Gate 14 like a slap across the face. Heads turned. A woman in a Navy Airline uniform stood stiff at the podium, her finger stabbing the air toward an older man in a worn green jacket. He didn't flinch, just blinked once, boarding pass in hand, eyes steady, but dimmed. Around him, the chatter thinned. Passengers froze in awkward silence. The old man glanced down at his card. A metal eagle pin caught the light on his collar, barely noticed. He spoke softly. "I was told," but the agent cut him off again, louder this time. "That's not how this works, sir. You're not on the list." He stepped back quietly, nodding. No protest, no scene. Just a slow turn toward the waiting seats. His steps were small. One hand gripped his bag, the other trembled slightly at his side. Through the glass behind the gate, a pilot in full uniform approached. He paused just before the counter. His eyes locked on the old man, and his jaw tightened. Someone was watching, and this time, he wasn't going to let it go. Charles Morgan had never liked airports, not since they'd grown so loud, so rushed, so unwilling to look a man in the eye. He had arrived at Terminal C 2 hours early, wearing a soft olive shirt pressed flat the night before, sleeves rolled to the forearms with the same care he'd used back when regulation mattered. His duffel bag, patched at the corner seam, sat at his side like a sleeping dog. There was no name on it anymore, just the fray of cloth where it used to be stitched. He stood now, silent in the line of waiting passengers, holding his laminated veteran ID and a boarding pass that still felt too light in his hand. He glanced once more at the gate monitor. Row 3, priority access, Group 1. That's what it said, and he remembered the phone call that confirmed it. The man on the line had called him Sir, said it twice even. Charles remembered that part more than the rest. His legs ached. They always did when the humidity came up before the storm. He shifted his weight, favoring the knee that had never quite been right since the drop in '69. He'd stopped taking pain meds long ago. Too many names on bottles. Too many mornings lost to haze. Today, he wanted to be present. Today, he wanted to fly home with his eyes open, all the way back to New Bern, where his daughter was waiting. The woman at the gate, the one who'd snapped, hadn't looked up from her screen when he first approached. Her hair was tight, her words tighter. She asked for his group. He answered calmly, pointing to the line that read, Priority 1. She tapped, frowned, shook her head. "That's not what I see here," she said without looking up. "If you want to rejoin boarding, you'll need to wait until your group is called. Not now." He had blinked, confused, and gently offered his veteran card. She waved it off with a motion so fast it felt like swatting a bug. "That's not priority. Back there, sir." The tone had cracked louder than needed, her voice drawing eyes from across the rows of waiting passengers. He hadn't said anything then. He simply nodded, turned, and stepped back toward the chairs. Each movement was deliberate, measured, bearing no trace of wounded pride, only the weight of memory. Charlie, they used to call him. Charles to those who needed the formality. 82 now, but the spine still straight, the eyes still sharp when they needed to be. He hadn't served for a medal, hadn't kept his jacket, hadn't told his neighbors much, but he'd flown reconnaissance and evac during 2 tours, once guiding a Blackhawk through monsoon winds with a hand radio and a prayer. He never talked about it, didn't think it was needed. These days, he just wanted to get home. He eased himself down into the row of stiff-backed terminal chairs. The vinyl gave slightly under his weight. He set his bag at his feet, adjusted the old cap on his knee. Not military issue, just navy blue with a small faded eagle. A boy across the aisle stared at him, curiosity in his wide brown eyes. His mother pulled him gently away without a word. Charles breathed slow, steady, remembering the old drill. Control what you can, endure what you can't. The noise of the terminal hummed around him. Intercoms calling out delayed cities, wheels clicking on tile, families speaking in tight, weary tones. And yet, beneath it, there was a quiet stillness to his posture. The kind that comes from knowing when silence is the strongest thing you can give back. Outside the tall window beside Gate 14, a storm was forming along the horizon. Gray light poured into the hall, making every reflection in the glass shimmer like ghosts. He looked at his hands. The knuckles were lined, the skin loose, but the grip was firm when he curled them around the boarding pass once more. He thought briefly of his wife, long gone now, who used to fold his shirts the night before a trip and double knot his shoelaces when his fingers started to stiffen. She would have spoken up at that gate. She had fire. He only had quiet, and something inside him said it had to be enough. A group of passengers brushed past him. Business travelers, sleek roller bags, murmurs of connection flights and deadlines. None of them looked his way. He didn't expect them to. He watched their feet more than their faces. How fast they moved, how quickly they forgot where they were. Then came the voice again, overhead this time, clear, polished, rehearsed. Now boarding rows 1 through 3, priority access. The words echoed like a bell in a sanctuary. Charles sat still, listening. His row had been called. His ticket matched the list, but his name had not. He rose slowly, feeling the ache at the base of his spine. Each step toward the gate felt longer than it should have. He didn't look at the agent again. He simply stepped toward the roped queue and was met by a flat palm held up in dismissal. The agent didn't even speak this time, just shook her head, brows raised. He stepped back again, once more to the vinyl seat. He folded his boarding pass neatly in half and placed it inside his coat pocket, right over the spot where the metal used to rest. He exhaled through his nose. No anger, no shame, just the weathered sigh of a man who'd waded through worse. Across the room, behind the check-in kiosk, a figure in uniform had turned to face him. The bars on his shoulder caught the overhead light. A pilot, still, watching, quiet, calculating. And Charles Morgan, who had waited out monsoons in the belly of a steel bird, waited again. The gate monitor flickered once, then rolled to a new list of zones. Charles blinked against the fluorescent light, his neck craning slightly to catch the change. His row still sat untouched, black text on a blue field, unmoving. Around him, the terminal moved with a rhythm he no longer belonged to. The clatter of phone cases, the shuffle of duty-free bags, the occasional hiss of air from the automated vents overhead. He glanced down at his hands, folded calmly over the cane resting across his lap. It wasn't a necessity, not entirely, but the right leg didn't move quite as fast anymore. He carried the cane more as a promise to his daughter than a crutch for himself. Now, even that felt like it drew eyes. A woman in a pressed blazer passed in front of him, not stopping, not apologizing when her rolling bag clipped the edge of his boot. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did. Her expression didn't change. Charles shifted slightly, pulling his feet in, the small motion betraying no bitterness, only the quiet resignation of a man who had been brushed past too many times. At the gate desk, the staff laughed at something. A phone screen shared quickly, thumbs tapping. One of them had a boarding pass scanner slung over a shoulder like a holster. Charles watched them without malice, just quiet observation. He understood youth. He understood distraction. But there was a time, he thought, when uniforms of any kind demanded stillness in their presence. That time had gone. The intercom crackled again. Final call for Zone 2. Please proceed to boarding. The voice was soft, near apologetic. He waited for his name. It never came. A man beside him, mid-30s, tie undone, eyes fixed on a tablet, stood and walked to the gate. His pass scanned. No trouble, no question. Charles looked down at his own again. Still folded, still in order. A child approached, the same one from earlier, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. He pointed at Charles's cap, then turned to his mother. "Is he a soldier?" he asked, not softly. The mother flushed, hurried forward, took the boy's hand and tugged him away. "Don't stare, Liam," she whispered, loud enough for Charles to hear. He smiled faintly at the boy, not because of the question, but because it was the first moment anyone had looked him in the face since he arrived at the gate. The smile faded as the footsteps receded. He shifted in his seat, wincing slightly as the seam of the chair pinched his side. He pulled the duffel bag onto his lap and slowly began to unzip it. Inside, wrapped in a soft towel, was a book he'd read halfway through, a worn paperback, dog-eared at the corner. He traced the page with one finger, then closed it again. Reading felt wrong now, too quiet, too removed from the world that had begun, very clearly, to forget he was in it. A staff member rolled past with a cart of fresh waters. She stopped at the front rows, business class, handing bottles to a man in a designer jacket and a woman speaking briskly into her headset. When she passed Charles's row, she didn't pause. The wheels clicked louder as she moved on. Behind the desk, the female agent glanced once toward him. Their eyes met, just barely. She looked away again, focused on her screen. Charles exhaled slowly, tightening the strap of his bag. He did not look angry. He did not move. He simply sat and endured. His eyes moved to the digital clock above the gate. It was 15 minutes past scheduled boarding. The storm outside had pressed closer, dimming the light across the terminal. The passengers grew restless, rising and reseating like waves on the shore. Overhead, the lights buzzed with soft static. And then, the next line on the screen. Group 3 now boarding. His row. Charles stood, straightened his shoulders, and moved forward. As he approached the ropes, another passenger, tall, mid-20s, noise-canceling headphones slung around his neck, cut in ahead of him. Charles paused, not wanting to push. The man looked over his shoulder, expression blank, then turned back without comment. The scanner beeped. He walked through. Charles stepped forward. The agent looked at him again. "I just said Group 3, she said curtly. "You're not on it. Sit down, please." He held out his boarding pass gently. "It says here." "I know what it says." Her hand pushed the scanner aside. "We'll call your name when it's your turn. Don't make this difficult." He didn't argue. He stepped back. Behind him, someone coughed. A soft murmur followed. The tension began to register, not in bold declarations but in subtle shifts. The way one man furrowed his brow, the way a woman touched her chest and glanced toward the gate. Small signs, the start of watching. Charles returned to his seat. He placed the boarding pass on his lap, unfolded it again with care. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his laminated veteran card, held it between two fingers, studied it, then slid it away, gently, into the same pocket. Outside, the tarmac lights began to blink in the soft gray haze. A figure in pilot uniform stood beneath the wing of the plane, clipboard in hand, face turned toward the building. His gaze had locked on the gate. Still watching, still deciding. A new announcement echoed overhead. "Final call for Group 3. The voice was thin and businesslike, straining to remain neutral under the rising tension in the terminal. Charles blinked slowly, then pushed himself upright once more. The boarding pass was still warm from his hands. He gathered his bag, adjusted the strap across his shoulder, and walked forward with quiet resolve. The gate agent barely looked up. She had already reached for the microphone again when she saw him approach. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I said we'd call your name," she repeated, her voice carrying farther than necessary. "You're not in Group 3. Charles held the pass out again, gently. "It's printed here. Group 3. I didn't change anything." His voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but fatigue. The hours had been long, the day longer still. The agent raised her eyebrows. "Sir, if your name's not pulling up in the system as eligible, I can't let you through." She turned her screen so he couldn't see it, then tapped a few keys loudly. "You're not priority. Please don't block the lane." The words landed hard, louder than before. A few passengers nearby turned their heads. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and a camouflage hat, narrowed his eyes. He reached down, picked up his backpack, and slowly walked toward the gate, stopping a few feet behind Charles. "He's a veteran," the man said, voice quiet but firm. "Maybe there's a way to override that." The gate agent didn't look up from the screen. Veteran or not, I follow procedure. If we start making exceptions, we lose order. She sounded rehearsed, not unkind, just unmoved. The other agent, a younger man at the second terminal, chuckled under his breath. Maybe he missed the memo, he muttered, loud enough to be heard. Status doesn't come from stories. A ripple passed through the crowd, not words, just a shift. The way people turned slightly, the pause in footsteps, the hush that fell like dust. Something had changed, but no one spoke. Charles nodded once, almost imperceptibly. He stepped back without protest. His face remained still, but his hand trembled slightly as it returned the boarding pass to his coat pocket. The veteran card slipped out with it, fell to the floor. He bent slowly to retrieve it. The young agent moved to help, then stopped himself. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Charles stood again, slower this time. His knees cracked audibly. Still, he kept his back straight. I flew with this airline last spring, he said softly. I used the same number. It worked then. We've updated the system, the woman replied flatly. What used to work might not now. Like I said, we follow the list. There was no apology in her voice, no understanding. The man in the camouflage hat shifted. Seems like there ought to be a little more grace. The younger agent turned. You need something? The older man shook his head. No, just watching. A long pause. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, unnoticed until then. Outside the window, a faint glimmer of orange touched the wing of the aircraft. The sun was beginning to dip behind the far row of hangars. Charles stepped back again. No one else moved. He returned to his seat slowly, lowering himself with both hands gripping the armrests. He stared straight ahead now, the boarding pass balanced on his knee. His name faced up. Charles Morgan, 82 years old, United States Army, Pacific Theater, 1961 to 1968. The room didn't know that. The staff didn't care. But the name was there, printed in fading ink. Behind the glass, near the loading ramp, the pilot remained still, clipboard lowered, his eyes now trained on the man who had just been told he wasn't important enough to board. He didn't speak, but he hadn't walked away. The chair creaked beneath Charles as he settled in again, one slow vertebra at a time. He leaned forward to ease the weight off his spine, hands clasped lightly between his knees. The knuckles were spotted and thick, skin folded like soft parchment over tendon and bone. Still, they held steady now, resting in calm. His breath moved in and out through his nose, barely audible, like the slow tide smoothing a distant shoreline. He didn't look around anymore. The gate monitor flickered once overhead, blinking back to the generic boarding information. The waiting area had filled with new passengers, most younger, most too busy to notice the man sitting upright near the window, his coat folded neatly across his lap. He wasn't sulking. He was preparing, always preparing. He reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a cloth handkerchief. It was ironed crisp, edges folded evenly, a deep navy blue with a white trim. It matched his old unit's colors, not by accident. He unfolded it once, shook it gently, and began wiping his boarding pass and ID as if cleaning a sidearm after rain. His gestures were slow, deliberate, precise. A boy across the aisle, no older than 10, had stopped tapping at his phone and was now watching. His mother noticed too late and gave his shoulder a gentle push, murmuring something about giving the man space. But Charles had already seen the boy. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just gave a slight nod. Recognition passed in silence. The floor beneath his boots was slick from the waxy afternoon cleaning. He adjusted his feet, spaced exactly shoulder-width apart, just like in the line, just like in the desert, just like in ceremony. Everything in his posture still whispered of training. The kind that doesn't leave a man even after decades have stripped away uniform, rank, and relevance. One of the flight attendants crossed in front of him, clipboard in hand, eyes on the manifest. She glanced at him and paused just slightly. Her gaze hesitated on the veteran patch above his chest pocket, but her steps did not falter. She kept walking. Charles didn't follow her with his eyes. Instead, he leaned back against the chair, the cool vinyl touching the back of his neck like a rifle stock chilled by night air. For a moment his eyes closed, not in sleep, but in stillness. And behind those lids, the sky was red again. Not the soft sunset outside the terminal glass, but the harsh dusk of another country, another year. Rotor blades cutting the horizon, smoke in the far distance, a field that hadn't been a field when the morning began. He could still feel the weight of the radio against his back, the codebook in his pocket, the vibration of boots behind him as they ran. Never from, always to. His fingers twitched slightly against his leg, then stilled again. Outside, the jet bridge door hissed as it sealed temporarily. The next boarding group had just cleared. Staff moved briskly behind the counter, resetting for the final call. No one addressed the man with a boarding pass already half faded from the pressure of his palm. Charles placed the cloth over his pass, folded it once, twice, then tucked it back into his jacket near his heart. From across the gate, the captain watched him, not casually now, but fully. His clipboard hung by his side, forgotten. His uniform, crisp and dark, reflected a subtle line of sunlight that cut through the terminal glass. He remained still as the others moved around him. His eyes never left Charles, and Charles, unaware, simply sat straighter. No one had invited him. No one had corrected the system. No one had spoken up again, but he had not slouched. He had not raised his voice. He had not begged. He had held the line. Captain Elijah Marston had walked through Terminal C 1,000 times before, but something about today slowed his steps. Maybe it was the hour, that strange space between late afternoon and early evening, where the light slants just so, warming polished tile floors and casting shadows long across the gate seating. Maybe it was the heat pressing through the glass, or the way the air conditioning clicked in bursts like a sputtering engine. Or maybe, and he would remember this later, it was the sight of a single man sitting too still while the world moved too fast around him. Elijah's boots met the terminal floor with the easy weight of someone used to heavy tread. His pilot cap was tucked beneath one arm, jacket buttoned to the top, not because it was required, he outranked the dress code, but because he respected what the jacket stood for. His flight was not due to board for another hour. He had intended to stop by the flight deck lounge, review the manifest, check weather reports. But the scene unfolding near Gate 14 brought his steps to a pause. He stood 30 feet away, far enough to remain unnoticed, but close enough to hear the clipped voices of the gate staff, voices that had shifted from routine protocol to something sharper, more performative. He had caught the tail end of it, a customer being dismissed, not denied outright, but maneuvered quietly into erasure. The older man was easy to spot. He wore his age-like armor, not defensive, just unhidden. The jacket folded across his lap, the stiff boarding pass, the quiet arrangement of posture, the cloth he'd used to clean his documents. Elijah had seen that kind of movement before. Not here, overseas, on the tarmac in Kandahar, in the hangars in Diego Garcia. Men who did not fidget, men who carried decades in their fingers, not their words. He watched as the veteran's name, spoken in half volume just minutes before, echoed back into his memory. Morgan, one of the staff had said impatiently. Charles Morgan. Elijah looked toward the main terminal wall where a flight board flickered in rotation. Charles Morgan. The name meant something. It stirred. He narrowed his eyes and adjusted the folder beneath his arm. Then he turned toward the gate desk, walking slower now, deliberately. The staff at the counter were too distracted to see him. The younger agent was laughing, not loudly, but enough. The supervisor leaned over a keyboard, half listening. None noticed that a uniformed figure with silver-striped sleeves had taken position just behind the seating area, watching the interaction like a tower observer scanning for crosswinds. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't step forward yet. He needed to see. Needed to be sure that what he thought he was witnessing was what it truly was. The older man had said nothing out of turn. Not once had he raised his voice or demanded special treatment. He'd shown a card, veteran status verified, and had been waved away like someone selling coupons in the rain. It was not overt disrespect. That would have been easier to challenge. This was something quieter, more lethal. It was omission, the kind of silence that erodes men from the inside out. Charles Morgan shifted in his seat again, his eyes flicking to the gate counter. His expression didn't change, but his spine told another story. Straighter now, deliberate. Elijah's hand tightened slightly on the edge of his folder. He knew who Charles Morgan was now. The records had crossed his desk the week prior. A courtesy flag, passenger profile, former Air Operations Commander, Vietnam, 36 years of service, retired under merit. He hadn't just flown missions. He had coordinated evacuation corridors when everyone else had given up. And now here he sat, in terminal lighting and a civilian coat, waiting to be noticed by a staff that measured value by status codes and priority lanes. Elijah didn't move yet, but he watched, memorizing faces, tones, gestures, and in the quiet space between announcements, something in his stance changed. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was preparing to act. The boarding chime echoed through the terminal, a flat, almost emotionless tone, more automation than invitation. The loudspeaker crackled as a staff member repeated the boarding announcement, calling for priority access and Group 1 to begin forming a line near the stanchions. The queue shifted, passengers rising, some gathering bags, others adjusting coats or glancing at seat numbers. But in the front row of the seating area, Charles Morgan didn't move. He simply looked at the boarding pass resting in his palm, then at the empty space ahead, his group number printed clearly, yet uncalled. The agent at the gate scrolled her tablet screen again. Her lips pursed, eyes narrowed, tone flat. "If your group hasn't been called, please stay seated," she said, without looking in his direction. But everyone knew who it was meant for. A few heads turned toward the older man in the light coat. He sat still, shoulders set, but his knuckles tightened around the strap of his small carry-on. Behind him, in the periphery of the scene, Captain Elijah Marston stepped forward. No announcement, no clearing of his throat, just the quiet confidence of a man used to being obeyed without raising his voice. His uniform was immaculate, silver stripes crisp against his sleeve, hat perched beneath his elbow, wings pinned clean above his left chest. He approached the counter and stopped directly beside the gate agents. The junior agent blinked up at him, clearly startled. She adjusted her lanyard, suddenly unsure of what to say. "I need to see the manifest," Elijah said. His tone was low but firm, not a suggestion, not quite a command. It was the voice of someone who had asked nicely many times and would only do so once more. The supervisor stepped in, his posture uncertain. "Captain Marston, I wasn't aware—" Elijah didn't wait for the apology. He scanned the screen, his finger tapping the manifest twice until it rested on a name highlighted near the bottom. "Charles Morgan," he said. "He is listed under priority passenger access, correct?" The staff hesitated, as if waiting for an out. "Well, yes, but it didn't show up in the pre-board filter." "It does now," Elijah replied. He looked directly at the younger staffer. "Call his name, then call the group. He boards immediately." The terminal went still. The low hum of carry-ons rolling across tile fell silent. An older woman near the back lowered her book. A toddler stopped kicking his feet. The mother beside him placed a hand on his shoulder without speaking. The staffer swallowed hard and picked up the microphone. Her voice this time was thin. The edges of confidence now filed down. "Charles Morgan, please approach the gate for boarding." Charles looked up, slowly, uncertainly. His fingers brushed the coat over his lap before rising. Every movement was deliberate, as if checking first whether he had heard correctly. He stood, holding his bag close to his chest, and stepped forward one careful pace at a time. Captain Marston turned toward him, and then, without flourish or delay, he brought his heels together, squared his posture, and lifted a hand in salute, clean, sharp, and unwavering. Gasps rippled across the waiting area, but no one spoke. No one dared. Charles paused mid-step. For a moment his expression faltered. Something in the lines around his eyes softened, dampened. He returned the salute. Not quickly, not rigidly, but with weight. The kind of gesture that spoke not of drill but of memory, of brothers lost, of missions survived, of promises kept in silence. The captain stepped aside and extended a hand, palm open, toward the gate. "After you, sir," he said. No microphone, no audience needed. Just those 4 words. Passengers at the front of the line stepped backward to clear his path. The rope between priority boarding and standard was quietly unlatched, and as Charles passed, the man who had once been treated like an error in the system now walked through the crowd with the air of someone returning to familiar ground. The gate doors opened, the jet bridge yawned wide, and beside him, not behind, not ahead, the captain walked in step. The staff stood still behind their counter, not reprimanded, not scolded, but changed. Every eye in the boarding area remained fixed on the man who had said nothing in protest, yet had won more dignity and silence than most earned with speeches. The hallway into the aircraft brightened with sunset slanting through the terminal glass. And as the 2 men disappeared past the final threshold, someone near the back whispered a phrase not meant for microphones. He shouldn't have needed a captain to be seen. Inside the narrow corridor of the jet bridge, the air held that mix of recirculated chill and late-day warmth, touched faintly by the scent of hydraulic fluid and worn rubber wheels. Charles's steps were slow, measured, not because of pain, but because of something else, a quiet awe. Beside him, Captain Marston walked with no urgency, his hat tucked beneath his arm, matching pace without fanfare. The sound of their shoes echoed softly in tandem, 2 different generations bound not by age, but by understanding. As they neared the cabin door, the flight crew stood at attention. The lead attendant, a woman in her early 40s with a trim navy blue uniform and hands folded respectfully, offered a nod, then stepped aside. Her voice was steady, but warm. "Welcome aboard, sir. Seats ready." Charles gave a small nod in return. His lips parted like he might speak, but no words came. Instead, he pressed his hand briefly to his chest, just above where the thin outline of his dog tag still rested beneath his shirt. Passengers already seated leaned out slightly into the aisle as he passed. One older man in the front row pulled back his armrest to make more room. A teenage boy in a sports jersey lowered his headphones, watching him closely, and then gave a small, uncertain nod that was answered with the ghost of a smile. Midway down the aisle, Charles turned his head slightly toward the captain. The glance wasn't long, but it carried something layered. The shared weight of years, of silent service, of rooms full of people who would never know what either man had seen. The captain returned the look with a firm nod, not of command, but of respect. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. At row 8, Charles paused and carefully stowed his bag overhead. A man across the row stood up to assist him, but Charles gently raised a hand, declining. His movements were slow but practiced, like someone who'd packed gear in the dark many times over. Once seated, he adjusted the buckle of the seatbelt across his lap, not rushing, not fumbling. The leather of his shoes creaked slightly as he shifted to place his coat behind him, folding it the way men of his era did. No wrinkles, no wasted space. The captain stepped back toward the cockpit without another word, pausing once at the front to speak briefly to a crew member. Whatever was said passed quietly, unnoticed by the rest of the cabin, but the tone was respectful, low, and final. From across the aisle, a younger passenger, perhaps in his early 30s, leaned slightly forward and spoke softly. "Excuse me, sir. Were you in the service?" Charles didn't turn. He just nodded once. The man replied, "Thank you," then sat back in his chair, adjusting his posture like someone had just reminded him of something important. A few rows back, a woman touched the hand of her husband and tilted her head in Charles's direction. Her expression had changed, No longer impatience to deboard or fatigue from the day. It was something closer to reverence. Charles exhaled and looked out the window. The sun had begun its descent past the far horizon, casting a golden line over the tarmac, igniting the edge of every aircraft wing in amber light. He blinked once, slowly, as if letting the warmth settle behind his eyes. The cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for departure. The safety briefing began, but few listened. Most continued watching Charles as if they were watching the closing pages of a story they hadn't realized was unfolding in front of them. And yet, Charles didn't revel in it. He didn't nod in thanks, didn't scan the crowd for recognition. His hands rested loosely in his lap, one thumb absently brushing against the aged plastic of his boarding pass. He had been seen, truly seen, and that was enough. The captain emerged from the cockpit one final time before takeoff, looked down the aisle to where Charles sat, and offered a silent acknowledgement with his eyes alone. Charles returned it. No nod this time, just stillness. The plane began to taxi. The engines roared softly into life. Outside, the sky deepened, fading from bronze to indigo. And inside, not a word was spoken, but something had shifted. A man who had been denied dignity only an hour before now sat beneath the quiet weight of 100 unspoken thank yous. The hum of the aircraft settled into a steady vibration beneath the soles of Charles's shoes, a low living thing that wrapped around his ribs like memory. He sat in silence, the tray table untouched, his hands folded neatly across his lap. The seatbelt stayed fastened, not out of necessity, but habit. The kind of habit that stays with a man long after the uniform is hung up. The cabin lights dimmed for cruising altitude, and the blue glow of twilight touched every face in the aisle. Halfway through the flight, the captain returned, not for ceremony, not for attention, just with a quiet purpose and a folded sheet of paper in his hand. He crouched beside Charles's seat, resting one hand against the edge of the armrest, his voice low. "I looked up your record before I stepped out there." Charles didn't turn at first, but his eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging him. The captain continued, "You flew over 70 recon and drop missions in the Pacific Theater. 3 tours. Medal of Honor nomination returned unsigned, twice." Charles's lips tightened, not in pride, in memory. "You were there at Luzon, weren't you?" the captain asked. Charles finally nodded. The motion was small. His voice was smaller. "Second wave. We came in under blackout. One of our birds clipped a tree on descent. We weren't supposed to go back for them." His voice faltered, not from weakness but restraint. "I went anyway." The captain said nothing. He just listened. "We lost half the men that night," Charles went on, "but 6 of them walked out because someone disobeyed orders." The captain lowered his gaze for a moment, then placed the folded paper in Charles's lap. "I had to see for myself. Most men with records like that don't talk about it." Charles didn't pick up the paper. He looked out the window instead, the soft sheen of moonlight casting his profile in quiet silhouette. The sky stretched wide and empty beyond the glass, a place he once knew like the back of his hand, a place that still knew him. "I never asked for thanks," he said, "just to be allowed dignity." The captain nodded. "You should have had both." The passengers around them had grown still. No one interrupted. No one scrolled phones or adjusted headrests. It wasn't that they were eavesdropping. It was that something inside the plane had settled. The atmosphere had changed. The story was no longer about delay or boarding priority. It had become about bearing witness. A woman too rose back, touched her husband's hand, and mouthed the word, "Luzon." He nodded faintly. An older man seated across the aisle let his hand drift toward the wall beside him and rested it there, knuckles white against the pale plastic, as if grounding himself. Charles didn't look around. He hadn't noticed the quiet spreading like light through fog. "You were seen today," the captain said quietly. "Not just by me, by all of them." Charles didn't speak, but his shoulders eased, almost imperceptibly. He folded the paper slowly, carefully, as though it were something fragile, something earned. He slid it into the inner pocket of his coat, beneath the threadbare flag pin, close to his chest. The captain rose with care and gave a small nod before turning to walk the narrow aisle back toward the front. No one stopped him, but every eye followed. In that moment, no one in the aircraft pretended they hadn't heard. No one looked away. The wheels touched down with a dull, weighty thud, the kind that vibrated through the floor and climbed the bones. The cabin lights flickered brighter, overhead compartments clicked, and passengers began their usual ritual of stretching, gathering, adjusting, the body preparing to leave the body of the plane. But something felt different this time. It was in the way people moved, quieter, more contained, as if they all sensed they had witnessed something they hadn't yet earned the right to explain. As the aisle filled with the usual shuffle of motion, the captain's voice came through the speaker, low, steady, calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin disembarkation, I'd like to request a moment of patience. One of our passengers today is someone whose service predates this airline, this airport, and for many of us, the very air we take for granted. Mr. Charles Morgan is a veteran of the United States Army Air Forces. He flew with valor, survived the Pacific campaigns, and returned to live a life of quiet dignity. Today, he reminded all of us, including myself, what that dignity looks like under pressure." There was no applause. Not yet. Just silence. "Out of respect," the captain added, "our crew will be escorting Mr. Morgan from the aircraft first. I ask that you allow this moment to happen." There was no resistance. Not one passenger stood. Not one hand reached for a bag. Charles sat motionless, eyes blinking slowly, one hand resting gently on the curved edge of the folded tray. The flight attendant at the front stepped into the aisle. She was young, barely 30, her hair pulled tightly back and eyes suddenly brighter than before. She extended her hand. "Mr. Morgan, may I?" Her voice was soft, sincere. Charles looked at her. For a moment, it was as if he couldn't move. Then slowly, he pressed his palms to the armrests and stood. His knees protested, but he stood tall, his frame still broad beneath the thin coat. His flag pin caught the cabin light, a silent glint that moved with him. The co-pilot waited near the cockpit door. The flight attendant walked beside Charles, not ahead, not behind, beside. As they reached the front of the cabin, the passengers began to rise, not with urgency, but reverence. One by one they stood. Some held hats over hearts. Others simply bowed their heads. The woman with the child placed her hand over her son's, keeping him still. As Charles stepped into the jet bridge, the door opened not to a hallway, but to a line of airline crew. The local operations manager stood at the center, flanked by two agents who earlier that day had been at the gate. Their faces were not proud. They were humbled. "Mr. Morgan," the manager said, his voice careful, "on behalf of the airline, and from all of us here, we were wrong today. That won't happen again." Charles nodded once, not harshly, but like a man accepting an overdue handshake. Not all wounds need words. Some need only to be recognized. Behind the gate counter, a new sign had been placed. Temporary, handwritten, but clear. "Veterans with priority status will be boarded first, without exception." The supervisor, who had dismissed Charles earlier, stood quietly near the edge of the wall. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed him, and when he looked her way, she dipped her head. She couldn't take it back, but she had seen. As Charles was escorted toward the terminal exit, a younger pilot approached from another gate, holding a small folder of documents. He paused, glanced at the line, and asked a passing attendant quietly, "Is that the veteran from Gate 14? She nodded. Without another word, the pilot stepped aside, removed his cap, and held it to his chest. The rest of the airport moved as airports do. Announcements, wheels rolling, distant engines humming. But in that terminal, something had shifted. Not in noise or decorum, in recognition. Charles didn't speak as he reached the sliding doors. He didn't need to. The policy had changed. But more than that, so had the posture of those who watched. The plane hadn't departed with him. It had waited for him. And now, Those who had once looked past him would remember him, not because of the uniform he no longer wore, but because of how he wore silence like a medal and dignity like a command. A week later, the same airport hummed with the usual rhythm of travel, rolling suitcases, distant paging calls, announcements layered over each other like background static. It was late morning, the sun pressing through the high windows with a pale autumn warmth. Travelers bustled around Gate 14, but among the flow of bodies, one man sat still. He was early, always early. Charles Morgan rested near the windows, his coat neatly folded beside him, a travel cup of black coffee in one hand, his other thumb grazing the edge of his boarding pass. His eyes followed the movement on the tarmac, the way a luggage cart curved behind a fuselage, the swaying shadow of a stewardess's skirt as she climbed the stairs. He was used to watching things unfold. His flight wasn't for another hour, but he'd already passed security, already been acknowledged. The same gate agent from the previous week had spotted him when he arrived. She didn't flinch this time. She stood, walked over, and said with an earnestness he recognized as real, not rehearsed, "Mr. Morgan, welcome back. You're first on the list today. Always will be, sir." He didn't smile exactly, but his nod carried the weight of something settled. Her hand gently brushed his shoulder before she returned to her station. He hadn't come for recognition, but it had found him anyway. Nearby, a boy sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor, sketching airplanes on a crumpled notepad. His mother kept one eye on the screens overhead, the other on her son's crayon. Charles glanced down at the drawing. Crude shapes, bold lines, two wings too long for the scale. But in the top corner, the boy had scribbled in block letters, "Thank you, veterans." He chuckled softly, not at the spelling, but at the heart behind it. As passengers gathered near the stanchions for pre-boarding, a quiet ripple moved through them. Eyes turned, not with confusion, but with memory. Some recognized him. A man in a business suit stepped forward, offering nothing more than a handshake. "Last week," he said, "I saw you board. My father flew in Korea. I never thanked him enough, but I'm thanking you now." Charles accepted the hand, firm but without flourish. "Then thank him when you can," he answered, his voice slow, words steady. Across the terminal, someone watched from the newsstand, a younger man, clean-cut, wearing a duffel slung over one shoulder. National Guard by the haircut. He caught Charles's gaze, then raised two fingers to his temple. It wasn't a full salute, just recognition. Charles mirrored it, an unspoken reply between those who know what uniformed silence sounds like. As boarding began, the announcement came without hesitation, no scripts shuffled, no confusion in the agent's voice. Pre-boarding now available for active duty, passengers with disabilities, and any veterans holding priority status. "Mr. Charles Morgan, you are welcome aboard first, sir." Passengers stepped aside as Charles stood, tucking the coffee cup into the trash and adjusting the strap on his carry-on. His gait was slow but balanced. He moved with the same deliberate calm of someone who has stood in open doorways at 15,000 feet, waiting for a green light. The gate agent opened the scanner with both hands. "Thank you again for your service, Mr. Morgan. We'll see you on board." He walked through the jet bridge without looking back. From that day on, Gate 14 held a different rhythm. Staff remembered, not just because of Charles, but because of the shift he left behind. The sign remained up, no longer handwritten, now etched in a brass placard just below the gate number. "Veteran priority boarding honored here." And every now and then, a flight crew member would mention, quietly over coffee or beneath the hum of boarding chatter, "That's the gate where the captain saluted a man before he flew." No one argued. Some nodded. A few smiled. Everyone understood. Charles never asked for the story to be told. But it was in the way the staff stood a little straighter, in the way the passengers paused when they heard the word veteran, in the boy's drawing, in the agent's softened voice. Respect had returned to the terminal, not loud, not forced, but steady as an inbound flight, arriving right on time. If stories like this resonate with your heart, Like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.